Chop Suey Nation, The Legion Cafe and Other Stories from Canada's Chinese Restaurants. Written by Ann Hui, narrated by Ann Hui. Author's note. This book is based on interviews, and many of the events described have been reconstructed from memories of what took place decades ago. I have attempted to be as accurate as possible in compiling these memories, but, as with all family histories, this one is messy, and it is possible that some of the details may have been misremembered. Also, for the sake of consistency, for people living in Canada, I have followed Canadian usage in writing their given name preceding their surname. Introduction. Until the year I turned 9, my family lived in the house across the street from our school. On one side of Franklin Street was the beige building where we attended classes, and on the other side was the white stucco house where we grew up. When the bell rang at noon each day, while everyone else ran off to the cafeteria or playground, my sisters and I went home for lunch. The three of us would walk across the street to find Mom cooking, usually fried noodles or fried rice. We'd walk in to see her cracking eggs and mixing them up with a pair of chopsticks for the fried rice. Into the wok she'd drop cold rice from the night before. Then she'd cut up some green onions and throw those in too. I hated green onions. I was jealous of my friends who got to stay at school for lunch. I was jealous of their brightly colored lunchboxes covered with cartoons and Disney princesses, and the fact that they got to eat lunch together. If they ate quickly, they could call dibs on the best swings and slides and have plenty of time on the playground. At home, Mom kept a stern eye on us as we ate. No one was allowed out the door and back to the playground until she could see the bottom of our bowls. I was jealous of what was inside my friends' lunchboxes, too. They ate the same things as the characters in our favorite TV shows. Neatly wrapped bologna and cheese sandwiches, Tupperware containers filled with SpaghettiOs or tomato soup, little plastic packets filled with fruit roll-ups or Minigo. It was the food they sold at Safeway and advertised in cartoon commercials. Normal food. The food we ate at home was something different. It was the same kind of different I felt when the white girls in class had sleepover parties and I'd lie and say my family and I were out of town. Chinese families didn't do sleepovers. It was the same kind of different I felt when friends would talk about Saturday morning cartoons. I'd nod along knowingly as if I knew my Darkwing Duck from my DuckTales. In reality, I was at Chinese school every Saturday morning, practicing dictation and learning classical Chinese poetry. One day in 3rd grade, a girl in my class, Cherie, turned to me on the playground after I came back from lunch. "What'd you eat?" she asked. Cherie was my friend, but I was intimidated by her. She was Chinese too, but I'd never seen her at Chinese school. I'd never seen her eating slimy noodles with pickled vegetables, or the soy-marinated duck wings I loved, even though some of the hairs were often still poking out. Cherie ate sandwiches and wore sweatshirts with the real licensed Care Bear and Fido Dido images on them. She didn't wear the knockoff stuff that relatives brought back to Vancouver in suitcases from Hong Kong the way we did. I imagined her parents spoke perfect, fluent English. I froze, feeling like I'd been caught. Like most days, we'd had fried rice with leftovers. "Sandwiches," I lied. My face felt hot as I turned away, hoping she wouldn't ask anything more. Making matters worse, our lunches weren't very good. Mom wasn't a good cook. She thought nothing of mixing together leftovers that had no business being mixed together. She would throw together whatever was in the fridge. Preserved salted vegetables, pickled and salty and straight from the can, with black bean and garlic spare ribs from the night before. Or she'd add cold cuts Dad brought home from work into fried rice with dried oysters. She just didn't care very much. Between working night at the post office and taking care of the three of us, shuttling us around to our piano lessons, swimming classes, and kung fu competitions, putting meals on the table was just another thing to check off the list. Food, to her, was simply a necessity. Flavor and pleasure were luxuries she didn't have time for. Pansy and Amber, my older sisters, were less picky. Most days, they would gobble up their lunches and run out the door before I was even halfway through. Other times, Amber, who's 2 years older and more shrewd, would stuff little grains of rice wherever she could think to, most often the poorest edge of the table. Every so often, Mom would watch, bewildered, as the dried grains fell from the table's edge, hitting the floor like raindrops. That would leave me by myself, drawing shapes and circles on the bottom of my bowl with the tips of my chopsticks. I'd gaze longingly towards the school playground, watching my sisters and my friends running around. Whining never helped. I knew from experience what would happen if I complained, the look Mom would give me, the flash of anger in her eyes, and the words that would soon follow. Lup, lup, gai sun fu. Each and every single grain from hardship comes. Still, there was one day of the year when we were allowed to stay at school for lunch, Chinese New Year. Our school cafeteria didn't have a daily meal program, but once a month, students could order a special item that was delivered straight to the cafeteria. There was pizza day, hamburger day, and taco day. And every year, sometime in January or February, there was Chinese Day to celebrate Chinese New Year. On that day, and only that day, Mom made an exception and allowed us to stay at school. The school is honoring our culture, she said. It's a chance to celebrate our heritage. The first Chinese lunch I can remember, I was about 6. I had looked forward to this day for weeks. Finally, I could stay at school like everyone else. I could eat in the cafeteria like everyone else. And my food would be the same as everyone else's. That afternoon, when the bell rang for lunch, I rushed to the cafeteria, my heart beating with anticipation. For once, my food was the kind kids were getting excited about. For that one day, at least, my lunch would be normal. As I stood in line at the cafeteria, I imagined the meal they'd have waiting for us. There'd be fish, surely. Every Chinese New Year meal had fish. I could explain to my friends what Mom had told us, how the word for fish in Cantonese was a homophone for excess or wealth. It was lucky. There would be chicken too, probably with the head still on. A whole chicken for Chinese New Year represented wholeness, a good beginning and end for the entire year. And dense, waxy li go, New Year's cake made of glutinous rice flour and brown sugar. Once cooked, it was wobbly and stuck to our teeth. Nothing like the cake we ate at birthdays. This one might scare my friends, but it was one of my favorites. Oily from the egg batter Dad fried it in, and sweet. Once my friends tried it, I knew they would like it. The line trudged on until finally it was my turn. The cafeteria worker passed me my plate, and I looked down. There was no fish, or chicken, or lean go. None of the Chinese New Year dishes I knew. I barely recognized anything on the plate. There were noodles, stained dark with soy sauce, limp-looking and glistening with oil. There was nothing mixed in with them except a few pallid bean sprouts. Next to the noodle was some kind of meat, deep-fried with a crunchy exterior and slicked in a fire truck red sauce. I dipped my finger into the sauce and licked it. It tasted like the red sugar candies Paw, my grandmother, kept in a tin above the refrigerator. None of these foods looked like anything we ate at home. As my friends buzzed around, laughing and shrieking, I could only sit there baffled. The banner in the cafeteria called this Chinese lunch. The school had called it Chinese too. So why had I never seen it before? Whose Chinese food was this? Those first few bites, I realized much later, were my introduction to Chinese Canadian, or chop suey, cuisine. For years after, I would hear relatives, including Mom and Dad, belittle this as fake Chinese. They would tell me that I should only want the authentic stuff. I would hear that this was food invented to trick Westerners, that it was cheap or poor quality, that the flavors were garish and lacking in refinement. Other times, relatives would say that chop suey was the only kind of Chinese that non-Chinese people would eat because the real stuff would scare them. Those relatives would tell me that our food was too slimy or gristly or strange for others to bear. Either way, I would hear over and over that this chop suey cuisine had little to do with Chineseness, and certainly nothing to do with us. What I didn't realize at the time was that this food would eventually grow into a lifelong obsession. And what I really didn't realize was that this foreign food had more to do with me than I could ever imagine. staring down at my plate that day, the cherry-colored pork and deep-fried spring rolls. I never could have imagined that these peculiar dishes might one day help me uncover my own story. Chapter 1, Victoria, BC, Spring 2016. On a gray Monday in March, I stepped out of the Victoria International Airport wearing my winter jacket and carrying a suitcase. Hours earlier, my husband Anthony and I had boarded a 6 a.m. flight from our home in Toronto to Vancouver. From there, we had transferred onto a smaller jet that took us to Victoria. Our plan was to drive across Canada in 18 days. Planning for the trip had begun many months earlier. During a story meeting with my editors at the Globe and Mail, I mentioned my interest in Chinese restaurants. I was especially interested, I said, in the chop suey-style restaurants I saw all over the country. There's tons of great, authentic Chinese food all over the country, I said. And yet this chop suey stuff, this not Chinese, is still everywhere. Why? One of the editors, Denise Balkason, was immediately intrigued. She encouraged me to develop the idea, and so over the course of the next few weeks, we brainstormed questions that this story might answer. I wanted to understand how so many of these chop suey restaurants were so astonishingly similar. At the chop suey restaurants I'd visited in BC's interior, in southwestern Ontario, and rural Quebec, Chinese somehow looked and felt exactly the same. Somehow, the restaurants all seemed to have the same red vinyl chairs, the same red tasseled hanging lanterns, the same paper menus, often printed on placemats, all printed in the same font. I also wanted to know how these chop suey restaurants were doing amid the massive influx of Chinese immigrants to cities like Toronto and Vancouver and their suburbs. The past few decades had introduced Canada to so many different kinds of Chinese. New waves of immigration from all over China, bringing with them very good, very authentic regional Chinese cuisine. No longer was it just Cantonese, but also Sichuan or Fujian or Hakka. So many varieties that it no longer made sense to talk about eating Chinese. Instead, it was Malaysian Chinese or Shanghaiese or Hong Kong Cafe Chinese or Kanji Noodle Chinese or Chinatown Small Plate Edison Bulb Chinese. I was curious what all these different types of Chinese food meant for the chop suey stuff. I wanted to know, with so much real Chinese food available, were people still eating the fake stuff? I also wanted to know what life was like for those running these restaurants. There was one restaurant that had captured my imagination right from the start. I'd stumbled across it on the internet in a blog post titled, "I can't believe there's a Chinese restaurant in Fogo." The post was about Fogo Island, the tiny island off the northeastern tip of Newfoundland. The post described a woman living alone, running a Chinese restaurant in the middle of nowhere. For miles around, she was the only Chinese person in sight. Her life seemed about as isolated as I could possibly imagine. I wanted to understand what would compel someone to live a life like hers. The question I was looking to answer was simple. It was a question I would repeat over and over as I made my way from coast to coast, visiting the many restaurants and explaining the purpose of my visit. The question was this: how did you wind up here? What brought you here? I forget when exactly, but at some point, my editors and I decided the trip would have to be a cross-country one. After all, as far as we could tell, every small town across the country seemed to have one of these restaurants. And so I began planning. I ruled out flying right away. Flying wouldn't get me to where I needed to go. I was interested in small towns, not cities with giant airports in them. I liked the idea of a train. After all, the railway was what brought many of the Chinese to this country to begin with. But travel by train would be slow. Plus, it would mean I'd be bound by schedules. So, driving seemed like the best option. There was one problem. I hate driving. But Anthony surprised me by volunteering to come along. By happenstance, he had stumbled upon some free time and was keen to join me on what was shaping up to be a trip of a lifetime. Here was a chance for us to explore together all the nooks and crannies of this country, all the places we might never otherwise think to go see. He would do the driving, of course. Anthony loves to drive. When we'd first met almost 8 years earlier, one of the first things he'd bragged about wasn't his job or his car or any of the usual stuff. It was about his driving ability, and he'd been right to. I'm stressed and anxious behind the wheel, but he's calm and collected. His driving is smooth, effortless. Once, when I was working in Victoria for the summer, he drove from Toronto to Victoria, and back again. Together, we'd driven through most of the northeastern U.S., all the way up and down the Pacific coast, and across parts of Europe. No matter where we've been, he's always known how to get where we needed to be. So it was settled. We would do the trip together, and he would do most, or all, of the driving. We would drive from coast to coast, we decided. I wanted to go north too, but that would have made the trip longer and even more expensive. With my fixation on Fogo Island, it made sense to save that stop for last. So it seemed logical to begin the trip on the opposite coast, in British Columbia. After all, BC was where the first major wave of Chinese men arrived in Canada in search for gold. When the men disembarked from their long boat journeys back in 1858, Victoria would have been their very first glimpse into this new world. BC was also where I'd grown up, where my own story began. It'd be nice to start the trip somewhere familiar. Outside the airport, Anthony and I waited for the shuttle bus to take us to the car rental office. Even though it was technically already spring, it was cloudy and cool, and I was grateful I'd decided at the last moment to bring my wool coat. Growing up, I'd visited Victoria from time to time. On school trips, I'd gone on tours of the provincial legislature or to the Royal BC Museum. Later, in my 20s, I spent a summer working as an intern at a local Victoria paper. By day, I'd write news stories about the weather and the local ferry service. The paper loved stories about the local ferry service. And at night, I'd hole up in my apartment, sulking about being away from my friends in Toronto. My landlord at the time was an artist whose occasional pot smoke would waft into my apartment through the cracks under the door, filling the room with the woody, skunky smell. I'd been struck at the time by how isolated Victoria felt from the rest of the country. I had crisscrossed much of the country by then, visiting all of its major cities in a previous summer job as a flight attendant. But Victoria felt completely removed from what I thought of as the rest of Canada, impossibly far from its centers of power such as Parliament Hill or Bay Street. It felt like a completely different country. After the shuttle bus dropped us off at the rental car office, we watched as one of the teenage attendants pulled up in front of us with our car. Instead of the Nissan Versa I had been expecting, the model listed in my reservation, he drove up with a tiny two-door white Fiat 500. Anthony and I turned to each other, eyebrows raised. "I thought I reserved a Nissan Versa," I said to the woman inside. She glanced at her screen and clicked a few buttons. "The Fiat is all we have available," she said. "Anything bigger will cost extra." We went back outside to look again at the car. Anthony is 6 feet tall. Even with the seats moved all the way back, I wondered where he was supposed to put his legs. The trunk, too, looked impossibly tiny. Although each of us had just the one small carry-on suitcase, I doubted we fit them both in there. Anthony walked up to the car and began testing out the configurations. He pulled the driver and passenger seats all the way back and tested the pedals. He put one of our suitcases in the back seat. Finally, he turned to me and gave me one of his characteristics, "It'll be fine," shrugs. "We'll make it work." Inside, the young woman finished her paperwork, punching buttons on her keyboard and preparing the invoice. "Right now you're paying..." Her voice trailed off, her eyes widening at the total. She scanned the screen again. "No, that can't be right." I looked at her and sighed. "Yeah, it's right. Instead of the hundreds it would normally cost to rent the car for the 18 days, the rental company was instead charging us thousands. For the service of picking up the car in BC and dropping it off elsewhere, all the way across the country in Newfoundland, that cost was exponentially higher." "It's one way," I told her. "We're driving across the country and dropping the car off in St. John's." She looked stunned. "You're driving all the way to..." She stopped, the wheels in her head turning. "Nova Scotia?" I didn't bother to correct her. I was too preoccupied with the astonishment on her face. Her expression said it all. We were about to drive across the entire country, from one ocean to the next, climbing up mountain ranges and navigating rocky terrain in this tiny toy car. The airport is about 30 minutes north of Victoria. We drove south down Highway 17, making a beeline for Chinatown. The forecast called for rain that afternoon, and I wanted to have a chance to walk around before it began to pour. We drove south along Government Street, rounding the corner at a familiar sight, the red and gold archway, the gate of harmonious interest. This was where Chinese immigration first began in Canada. Before continuing on to the Fraser Valley, gold seekers had to stop in Victoria for a mining license. Locals weren't interested in having these men around, so the Chinese set up their own shanty towns, crude huts and temporary shacks, sometimes one built on top of another, to stay in until they were ready to continue with their journeys. Over time, some stayed behind to build the area into a neighborhood of sorts, with services and businesses for these new arrivals, laundries, supply shops, and cafes. Chinatown was born. Decades later, the promise of work on the Canadian Pacific Railway would lure another wave of thousands of Chinese men to Victoria's port, a new boom of Chinese to the country. The Chinese were paid $1 for every $1.50 to $2.50 the white men were paid, and given the most dangerous tasks, such as using explosive to blast through tunnels. And, unlike the white men, the Chinese weren't given food or equipment. Many died in accidents, but many more simply died from the cold or malnutrition. Those who stayed behind in Chinatown didn't have it easy either. Locals saw the cheap labor they provided as a threat. Others blamed the Chinese for what they claimed was an increase in crime and disease. Whether it was out of concern for safety, or for camaraderie, or convenience, many of the Chinese men chose to stick together in close geographic quarters as they spread across the country, areas that came to be known as Chinatowns. In 1887, hundreds of white people led a march through Vancouver's Chinatown, carrying signs reading, "Keep Canada White," and "Stop Yellow Peril," rioting and destroying thousands of dollars worth of property. In 1907, there was another Vancouver riot, this time with thousands of white men smashing Chinatown windows and again sending residents fleeing. Responding to these protesters' fears, governments across the country put in place laws to restrict the Chinese. Several provinces outlawed Chinese businesses from hiring white women, claiming it would put these women at risk. Many parks and swimming pools banned the Chinese from entering. And, in many parts of the country, Chinese were barred from entering most professional occupations, including medicine, law, and engineering. So only a few options remained: convenience stores, laundries, or restaurants, what was considered women's work. We parked and walked over to Fantan Alley. Wedged between two brick buildings built just a few feet apart, the narrow passageway led us towards the hidden shops and businesses in between. As we wound our way through the alley, a group of tourists posed for photos near the entrance. During my last summer in Victoria, I had gone on a walking tour of Chinatown with a group of Australian and British tourists. The guide had spent the bulk of the tour here in Fantan Alley, conjuring up images of a dark and mysterious society. He'd pointed out the secret passageways, describing how they'd once led to gambling and opium dens, brothels even. There, he had said, pointing upwards at the second-floor balconies, is where the Chinese men stood on guard on the lookout for police. His description was partly fair. There were brothels and gambling dens in Chinatown, along with all kinds of other businesses. But what he didn't fully explain was why. He didn't explain how the wages the Chinese men earned working on the railway or at Chinatown businesses were barely enough to support themselves and send money home to their families, let alone enough to bring a wife or a family to Canada. So these Chinatowns became bachelor societies, with gambling and opium emerging as some of the main social activities. The gambling and opium in turn made it even more difficult for some of the men to be able to send money home, creating a vicious cycle. The few Chinese women who did live in Canada were either the wives of relatively wealthy merchants or else women who had been sold into servitude, either as domestic servants or prostitutes. The head tax further cemented this gender imbalance. In 1885, the federal government implemented a $50 tax on every Chinese person who wanted to enter the country. The tax only applied to the Chinese. And in the following 20 years, the tax would only be increased further and further, peaking at $500 in 1903. The tax sent a very clear message that Chinese immigrants were not welcome. Later, in 1923, the Canadian government took the unprecedented step of banning immigration from China altogether. Canada's Chinese Exclusion Act mimicked a similar policy south of the border. In the U.S., there was no head tax. The U.S. instead implemented a ban on Chinese immigration in 1882 and eventually repealed that ban in 1943. But Canada took 4 years longer to repeal its policy, until 1947. And it wouldn't be until the 1960s that Canada began accepting significant number of Chinese immigrants. We continued east along Fiskard, past painted murals of Chinatown's history. In one, a family posed stiffly for a portrait. The man in the center, Li Mong Kao, was wearing a blue silk robe and black Qing-era round court hat. He rose to the position of chief interpreter for Canada's Department of Customs, the Black Reg. He was one of the elite few Chinese to have a family in Canada with him. His children, dressed in silk garb, posed in front of him. The boys wore their long hair tied back neatly. I couldn't imagine what the white locals made of these families with their brightly colored robes and pigtails, or what the Chinese thought of the locals. Just a stone's throw away, a stately brick building stood out, with red lanterns hanging off the pagoda roof in neat rows. I squinted to read the sign, Chinese Public School. After white locals complained about unclean Chinese children attending the same school as their own, residents of Chinatown set up this school, and it was Li himself who would serve as its first principal. The last time I'd visited this Chinatown, I had winced at the carved dragon archway, the little pagodas topping the phone booth, and cheap qipao for sale everywhere. I was struck by the shops and businesses that seemed to offer only souvenirs for tourists. It felt like a museum rather than a working Chinatown. They were selling the idea of Chinatown, I complained. I pointed at the colored paper parasols, Hello Kitty knickknacks, and Japanese kimonos. It was all fake Chinese. Even the street signs were printed in that wonton font meant to evoke Asia. Meanwhile, the Chinese characters printed on the street signs on every sidewalk corner were nonsensical, phonetic approximations of the English ones. They looked and sounded Chinese, but they didn't actually mean anything. It seemed like the perfect metaphor for this place. But this time around, I had mellowed. I understood now the fate of other Chinatowns across North America, how many, including Vancouver's, had been left struggling in the wake of Chinese immigration, moving instead to the suburbs. In the case of Victoria, many of the city's Chinese left altogether, departing for larger cities such as Vancouver or Toronto. Since the mid-20th century, Victoria's Chinese population had been gradually dwindling. So, locals banded together, restoring historical buildings in the area and rebranding the area as a tourist destination. Now I could see that the Victoria business owners were just being pragmatic and selling what they could to stay afloat. As we made our way back towards the western edge of Chinatown, we saw how some of the businesses gave up on the Chineseness entirely. We walked past old buildings and storefronts that had been converted into hipster coffee shops and offices for tech startups. On the western edge of Fiskard was the restaurant I'd been looking for. Both sides of Fiskard were littered with restaurants and shops, but one had always stood out from the rest, with its retro neon signs and flashy decor. We stopped in front of it, taking in the details. The white sign was designed to look like a paper lantern, with the name Don Mi etched in a thick black wonton font. Underneath, in red neon lettering, seafood, Sichuan, hot iron plate. I'd always been curious about this place. I left Anthony on the sidewalk and hiked up the flight of stairs to the restaurant. The dining room was sprawling, with dozens of tables covered with white tablecloths. The napkins were flame-folded and stuffed into water glasses. Waist-coated servers wandered around the room. It was late afternoon, after the lunch rush, but there were still a few tables with customers in the large dining room. Some were obviously tourists, white couples with guidebooks lying on the table next to them. But there were a few Chinese families there too, having late afternoon dim sum, huddled over cups of tea. I picked up a menu lying on the counter by the entrance. The restaurant had all the classics of chop suey cuisine. The crispy spring rolls, kung pao chicken and wonton soup. But they also had all of the dishes my parents might order. They sold the shredded jellyfish appetizer I loved, cold, springy strands of jellyfish bathed in sesame oil, chili, and vinegar. They also had the fish maw soup my sisters and I hated growing up. Not because it was made of fish bladders, which we didn't even realize, but because the spongy, chewy texture reminded us of dish towels. It was a delicacy, Mom and Dad claimed. In my mind, a Chinese restaurant had always been one or the other, authentic or not. But John Me seemed to be both. The restaurant had weathered over 80 years in Victoria. It had seen many generations of Chinese immigration and many versions of Chinatown. And, whether by design or out of self-preservation, the restaurant had reinvented itself over and over again. The middle-aged woman standing behind the counter eyed me up and down, glancing between my business card and my airplane rumpled appearance. I spoke to her in English first, then switched to Cantonese when I saw her confused expression. I told her the reason I was there and my plans to cross the rest of the country to visit Chinese restaurants just like this one. She wrinkled her brow, staring at me skeptically. At last, she spoke. "Everybody here is busy and working," she said in Cantonese. "Someone will call you." The look she gave me reminded me of the young woman at the rental car desk, that mixture of amusement and skepticism. It was clear that nobody was going to call. As I walked out of the restaurant, I wondered how many other restaurant owners would wind up responding to me in the same way. As a reporter, it was a doubt I was already well acquainted with. It was a question I thought about often, each time I approached a new community and asked to speak with its leaders. A question I thought about each time I asked to speak with someone who had nothing to gain by speaking with me. And it was a question I knew I would carry with me into every one of these restaurants. When the restaurant owners first set eyes on me, they would see in me someone who looked a little bit like them. But from the moment I introduced myself, they might also see the opportunities I'd been given that they hadn't. I was born in Canada. I grew up speaking English. I got to go to university, then graduate school. In most cases, we were only a single generation apart, but I had been given so much, and now I was walking into their lives and asking for more. Who was I to walk in and demand to know people's stories? Chapter 2, Burnaby, BC, Summer 2016. In late summer of 2016, I landed at the Vancouver airport. It was another trip to visit with my parents. They pulled up to the airport in their Toyota Matrix, Dad behind the wheel as usual. And on the ride back to Burnaby, Mom chatted excitedly, as usual. "Did you eat on the plane? How's the weather in Toronto? Is the gas as expensive in Toronto? What's Anthony doing in Toronto while you're gone?" It was late, and I was tired, and I answered most of her questions half-heartedly. Plus, my mind was elsewhere. It was just a few months after Anthony and I had finished our cross-country road trip. During our travels, I'd seen my own parents in so many restaurant owners' faces. So many of the men and women I spoke with reminded me specifically of Dad. The restaurant connection was a part of it. Until his retirement about 10 years earlier, Dad worked in restaurants. The food was different. Dad made Western food. He had been head chef at a big buffet-style restaurant in Vancouver called the Copper Kettle in the 1980s. There, he made giant roasts, baked hams, and wobbly jellied fruit molds. Later, he started his own catering company where he served up large banquets for weddings and fancy corporate parties. When he came home at night, he'd sometimes bring us leftovers from the cold-cut platters the size of car tires, creamy fettuccine Alfredo, and lasagna with crispy, cheesy crusts. Sure, the food was different, but restaurants were restaurants. Many of the Chinese restaurant owners I'd met had even looked like him. This was likely because most of them had come from the same region in southern China as Dad, the same cluster of small villages outside of Guangzhou known as Toisan. They had the same eyes that squinted at the corners when they smiled, the same high cheekbones. As the restaurant owners had sat across from me, telling me their stories, I had often thought about my dad, and how many of the questions I was asking these owners were ones I'd never thought to ask him. There were so many gaps in what I knew. What was his life like back in China? How did he wind up in Canada at age 24? And why did he come to Vancouver decades after his own parents? Growing up, Dad was just Dad. In the mornings, he'd drop us off at school in his Honda hatchback, and at night, he'd come home from work, scrape the dried tomato sauce or meat grease off his hands, and then begin making our dinner. We'd eat quietly, heads hunched over, the sound of chewing only punctuated by chopsticks clicking against our bowls. Afterwards, he'd watch the Cantonese medical dramas or cop shows they played on the Chinese language channel until it was time for bed. Every day was the same. On the weekends, when he wasn't working his second job as a contractor or his third job as a landscaper, he'd ferry us between lessons or attend our piano recitals and ballet performances. Sitting in his chair, his eyes closed, he'd nod along to the music in his paint-splattered polos. He had a few hobbies. He liked to read, and sometimes he'd practice calligraphy, practicing his brush strokes by writing classical Chinese poems. Later, he would also take up hiking and traveling, but when we were growing up, pretty much all of his time was spent working. He did it all quietly. He didn't talk about himself. He definitely didn't talk much about his life before us. He seemed to prefer listening to talking. The year I turned 21, I left Vancouver and moved to Toronto with vague ideas of a career in journalism. He drove me to the airport. On the car ride there, he barely spoke a single word. And at the airport, he refused to help me lug my giant suitcases onto the baggage belt. "You're going to have to learn to do things for yourself now," he said quietly but sternly. I know he just couldn't bear to do it himself. After that, our conversations were limited to the brief phone calls I would make back to Vancouver. Quick exchanges of, "Hi, how are you?" before passing the phone over to Mom. Visits home were crowded with other family and friends. On the rare occasion we were alone together, the conversation stayed focused on practical matters. He'd ask about the real estate market in Toronto, or about the weather we'd been having, or what I wanted to eat for dinner. It seemed like a cliché, the stereotypical Asian dad, stoic and incapable of expressing his feelings. But that wasn't entirely true. The stereotype wouldn't explain how, when I was in kindergarten, he was the one to brush and style my hair every morning. It also wouldn't explain the time he was the only one who could make my cousin Taylor, then still an infant, stop crying by rocking her to sleep, curled up on his chest. Or the many lunches he packed for me during university when he knew I was busy studying. The sandwiches he'd roll up into neat pinwheels. The carrots he carved into flowers. The truth was, I hadn't spent much time getting to know him as an adult either. I had just treated him as Dad. But then we got the news. For several months in the summer of 2015, doctors had been concerned about a tumor they'd found in Dad's liver. At the end of July, just a week before Anthony and I had our wedding in Montreal, the results of the biopsy confirmed the diagnosis. It was cholangiocarcinoma, or cancer of the bile duct. At the wedding, after Dad gave his father of the bride toast, I clutched him and cried. After the diagnosis, it was one piece of bad news after another, each more dire than the last. On our honeymoon, Anthony held my hands as I read the text from my sister. The cancer was inoperable. Most patients survived for just 9 months. There was no hope of a cure. Each time we'd think, how will we cope? And eventually we'd adjust, and then days later there'd be another blow, over and over again until trauma began to feel normal. "I feel fine," Dad would say. "As long as I can walk, as long as I can eat, I am okay." He'd go through one cycle of chemo and then the next. For the first while, it really did seem fine. Between the chemo cycles, he still went on his Saturday hikes, leading his hiking group up countless trails, the bells he'd sewn onto his backpack to warn away bears jangling behind him. He still shopped at the supermarket and made dinner every Sunday. "I'm not going anywhere anytime soon," he told us. We all coped in our own ways. Mom fretted from one Chinese doctor to the next, bringing home bundles of herbs and roots she thought might heal him. Pansy kept track of his schedule, managing his dozens of appointments, tests, and procedures, and making sure he knew how to prepare for each one. And Amber paid frequent visits, helping out around the house and plotting ways to get him out, even if it was just to walk in the park with her dog. From Toronto, I awaited news. I pitched stories to my editors that would allow me to spend weeks or months at a time in Vancouver. But during these visits, I was at a loss for what to do. The day-to-day stuff, the ferrying Dad to appointments, the organizing, the important stuff, my sisters and Mom already had covered. I tried to find time alone with him, but he was still Dad. He wasn't interested in small talk, much less discussing what he was going through. I'd ask how he was, if there was anything he'd want to talk about, and he'd only shrug as if to say, "Would it help?" More often than not, we'd wind up sitting in silence, Dad watching TV or slumped over in his chair, eyes closed, lost in thought. As kids, we pretty much only saw Dad's parents, Ye and Angin, on holidays. There was always a stiffness to those visits, particularly between Dad and his dad, Ye. I'd heard bits and pieces of arguments over the years. About that one time Mom and Dad went to visit with Pansy, then still an infant, and how Ye wouldn't let them in the house. By the time I was a teenager, both grandparents had passed away. The day Ye died, Dad started smoking again. He was moody for a long time, withdrawn. Whatever the two of them had fought over, they'd never managed to resolve. No one ever explained what had happened. All I had was what I had gathered through the years. Overheard phone calls, the clenched whispers in the kitchen, and Dad didn't seem to want us to know. Gradually, I pieced together that it all seemed to stem from the same issue. It was the one thing we were never supposed to talk about. Dad had been left behind in China. His parents had come to Canada without him. It wasn't clear if he knew why, and if he did, he wasn't sharing. Mom had freely shared her own stories over the years. While Dad was cautious and careful, she was outspoken and emotional. Over dinner or on long car rides between ballet and piano classes, she'd tell me about growing up in Hong Kong, about how her father, Ye, had dreamed of writing for newspapers but died when she was just 9. She'd lower her voice to just above a pained whisper as she described how Paul had supported her and her 3 siblings by running a wonton shop in Hong Kong, and how she'd followed her brother, my Uncle Zachary, to Vancouver after he'd immigrated here in 1971. But Dad had always kept his stories closely guarded. If someone mentioned Mao, Dad might let out a flash of anger. Or if they mentioned Pierre Trudeau, a burst of approval. Otherwise, he'd only shake his head on the rare occasion we'd think to ask. He'd slowly raise his arm as if to say, "Stop." "Tak la," he'd say, still shaking his head. "Enough." In the car, Dad kept driving silently. Mom had given up after my umpteenth vague response. She switched on the radio, which crackled the Chinese local news. In my head, an idea was bubbling. "Dad, what are you doing tomorrow?" His response came in a grunt. "Nothing," he said in Cantonese. Perfect, I thought. The next afternoon, as Dad was just settling in his favorite spot on the couch next to the window and curled in the sun like a cat, I parked myself on the other couch beside him. "I want to know about the Legion Cafe," I told him. It was a restaurant he'd owned with my mom in the 1970s, before I was even born. Growing up, I'd heard occasional mentions of the Legion, how Mom and Dad had moved out to Abbotsford, about an hour outside of Vancouver, and at that point very much still a small town. They had owned it for several years, then shut it down. It was one of 2 restaurants they had run in Abbotsford before eventually moving back to Vancouver. I'd heard a few anecdotes. Dad